Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I appreciate all the adventurous people who decided to stay in this room at 5 o'clock with a title that doesn't say that much, and I think it must be very adventurous or needed to have some warm environment and cozy environment beside the cold we have there at the exhibition floor. The title of this presentation this afternoon is Changing Nature of Open Source, and changing is about, it's not so much about something that moves from A to B and changes one way to another, and from one situation or one condition to another condition, but it's also something that changes depending on the way you look at it. Maybe a little bit like the weather in Porto Alegre, where you wake up one morning, it looks very nice, it's cold, and then this is changing too, and then it changes again and again. Or maybe we want to get rid of this. Okay, we don't need that, do we? Yeah. So this discussion, I'm trying to share with you some reflections on our perception of open source from a platform that I use to look at things, which is the OW2 consortium, OW2 being an open source organization, and you can think of us as a Brazilian/European/Chinese Apache, where we try to be an alternative in the open source world. So we've been around for 7 years, and from that we've had a look at what open source is, knowing that it hasn't always been open source, because of course in the beginning there was free software, or maybe I should say there was Unix in the beginning, but let's start with free software. And free software, and I apologize for those who know that by heart, is defined by these 4 simple rules. The number 1 starting with 0, of course, being the right to use the software for whatever you want to do, which is something you cannot do with proprietary software. The right to look at the code, to actually understand how it runs, which is something you cannot do with proprietary software. The right to distribute copies of the code, like a good book you like, which is something you cannot do with proprietary software. And the right to change, modify it, and redistribute modified copies of this code, which is again something you cannot do with proprietary software. And these 4 simple rules have had the power to change the whole software industry, or they're in the process of changing the software industry. But these rules define what we call free software. And I'd like to reflect on what is free software and how it has evolved into open source, and how free software, being something that is well defined, it is implemented in real life into something that is open source and that is not so well defined. Let's have a look at this. Once you have this free software and the possibility to contribute, to change, and to share the software, the code, we've had scholars, and this is already old study by Lacan, looking at the motivations of contributors. And when you look at these motivations, you realize that software freedom doesn't seem to come as a top motivation there. There are many motivations, you can read them, including professional status. And that motivation, that is the one that really would be to support, defend, and fight for free software, which would be the one about beating proprietary software. Because again, I've defined free software as something that you cannot do with proprietary software. These motivations, they come somewhere last. So they contribute not so much for freedom. Then, drilling into these results, you realize that they have volunteers and paid contributors. And eventually, what you realize is that they don't have all the same motivations. That some contributors look at open source or free software in one way, and the paid contributors, they're simply doing their jobs. They're contributing to free software because their boss wants them to do that because it's useful for their companies. So looking at that, you can think, well, we have free software, but then we have different ways, and looking at people's behavior, the way free software is implemented in real life is through what I call open source avatars. So in the beginning, we had free software, and free software is, in real life, implemented through a number of avatars. We can call free software like a legal construct, because there are all sorts of rules of the whole legal environment. You can find the technology avatar, which is like the Linux platform. This is one way where you concentrate all the energy on open source. And I'd like to highlight three avatars, one being what I call the lifestyle open source. The other one I call business strategy open source. And the third one I call public policy open source. Lifestyle open source is something I would identify with young, educated, urban IT professional or academics. Many of them at field, I would say. Contributing in order to develop this kind of feeling of ownership over the output of one's work. I mean, you're just not working because somebody tells you to do that, because you submit it to some chain of command, but you choose to do it. You own your work, and that's a contribution to freedom in a way, really. You find that supported by many communities, fostering values, even alternative values. And there we're not in a mainstream business-oriented or technology. We are in a way that where we create our own breathing space, our own way to control our lives, our destiny. And I see these lifestyle open source behavior more concentrating on what I would call maybe client applications. The cool things is to develop an app for the Android platform these days. But contribution to Mozilla, to LibreOffice are really part of these, what I see these lifestyle open source. And it is, of course, based on whole philosophical environment and lots of values from Plato and democracy, utopia, Hume, Locke, and all these values where people try to define their whole context, their environment, their whole lifestyle, based on reciprocity, sharing, and all these high-level values that are money-driven societies tend to forget. That sounds very utopian, but it works. It works, why? Because developing technology on an open source way is efficient. It allows you to share the technology, it allows you to access competencies you might not have. I mean, I think it was Bill Joy who said in the 90s that there is always somebody else more intelligent out there, or the competence you don't have, there is somebody else who has the competence. So this is the traditional, I mean, the open source you really know about, and that's the kind of open source on which the Linux operating system has been developed and thrived. Then let's look at the business strategy open source. That's another kind of open source, a whole world of open source that has been developed by catching or leveraging business opportunities based on some mechanism I will develop later, It's typically the commoditization of software, enterprise software, or using collaborative innovation in order to go faster than the competition, and business models essentially based on subscriptions. These business strategy open source, I would say technically would maybe concentrate more on the enterprise segment, enterprise computing, and infrastructure software, something that is not necessarily very cool. I mean, how do you demonstrate a middleware? I mean, there's nothing graphic, nothing flashy to show on the screen. Middleware is just a series of text lines that go down, and when the server is up, it works. And this is where you have many of those the companies that are open source famous. I can name Red Hat, Canon, Sugar CRM, but also the large companies also are investing in it because it makes business sense, and we will look at it. So somewhere, these are really the companies that made the change, have the free software through some dubious ways that I will try to explain. It made the free software evolved into what we can call commercial open source. And it works. It works because you can realize that open source is economically efficient. These companies make money, users may save money, and free software in the terms of gratis also makes sense. We'll come back to that. And then there is public policy open source, which I would say is open source driven by governments, by their growing awareness, because governments are very large IT users. They have a vested interest in IT, in their independence, in making the right decisions, but also in that's the role of government to develop social welfare. And they look at IT being something so strategic that IT may be one lever through which we can help develop social welfare, grow the competency of the people, create value within a community, make people better rich. And they look at really infrastructure applications, what is the bedrock of the information society. And we have several programs. Of course, here we have the portal of Software Público in Brazil. In Europe, we have the FP7 programs in Ocean. And this morning, we have the presentation about some of the government programs. The only one that came to mind was the Open Source for America, but there are many others, I understood from this morning, Deborah. And this is not a whole thread of actions there. That is really motivated by what? By the fact that 90% of the software industry worldwide is dominated by private North American software companies. That's huge. I mean, some people say in France that large proprietary companies could literally decide whether some car companies or public administrations can keep running or not. Such is the potential power risk. So governments are aware of that. So non-American governments are aware of that, of course. It's a question of sovereignty. But even North American government is aware of that. They can be even dependent on companies that are profit-maximizing companies, and they need to have their degree of freedom of maneuver. And it works there as well, because it's socially efficient. It helps create value. It helps have people work because they want to work, keep the value within a community, raise the competence. So those are the three, I would say, the three avatars, and they change. And the changing nature of open source is in the fact that the real-life implementation of the free software idea is confronted to constraints, but also benefits from an evolution and the knowledge acquired through experience. And that makes it change. I'm not a socialist, not socialist maybe, but a social scientist, so I'm not going to drill on the lifestyle open source. I'm not a politician and I'm not going to look at the public policy open source, but I'd like to drill on the business strategy open source and highlight some mechanisms through which these things have evolved. And I'm pretty sure that somebody can develop some research on the social part, on the part, or even on the legal part, because I think the legal part will evolve as well. So let's just look at quickly at how business open source has evolved to really understand of what this real life is made of, but what are the mechanisms. I'd like to highlight some mechanisms that explain how it evolved. So let's first of all look at the achievements. Business open source or business strategy or this kind of business open source is really what made open source rich and probably why many people are here today. First of all, the internet would not exist without the Apache server. The Apache server is represents 40–50% of all internet servers, and that's a key achievement. I mean, you can't move that. Independent market survey or market analysis companies are identifying huge values for the open source market. I remember figures for IDC that was rating the open source market at $8 billion for software. This is a survey about the European market, which is geared to be over 14 billion euros next year. So this is real money and growing fast. What's important there is that all market projections give the two-digit growth to the open source market, which is where really value is being created. I know many companies in the proprietary sectors that would like to see this kind of growth and have access to this kind of market. So there's a real interest. I mean, it really is changing the software industry. Maybe it only represents 10% of the software industry, but that creates a change. 10% moving one direction implies a whole change for the whole. Think if you're driving on a motorway and like 10% of the cars decide to slow down, everybody will slow down. And the value of open source has been identified by venture capitalists. They know that it's value creating, and they have invested billions of dollars in software startups. And even recently, over the last 3–6 months, there's been dozens and dozens of millions of dollars invested in its open startups. And probably the high point of this evolution was in July 2009, when the Standard & Poor's company decided to include Red Hat into their index. And the S&P 500 is an index of showing where the publicly held large American companies are heading to, and it proves that open source has become really mainstream. And what happened is that, and let's look at more enterprise software, what you see is that in every single product category in the enterprise market software, you have an open source alternative. All these product categories on the right hand, with all these products that have been developed by proprietary vendors, have been matched and sometimes killed by proprietary software. If you look at the second category of those with companies in brackets, I remember some companies like Vignette and Documentum, they were the darling of the NASDAQ. Very successful companies. These companies don't exist anymore. They just don't exist. They're not independent. They've been acquired. So that really shows you how the whole industry has moved towards open source, and some product categories are moving to open source. But when you look at this, sometimes I'm really tempted to say, but actually you guys in open source, you much invented that much. Finally, haven't you just copied what was invested developed, identified, created, marketed by proprietary companies. In order to match that, of course, when I say that, I have many other examples of innovations that have been built by open source. But the money and what made open source successful, recognized by everybody else, and made it attractive, and make it change and important in the software industry, this is here, the change, that's the kind of change that really made open source where it is today. That has been a key initial driver that made open source take off. But because it has been developed on the basis of product categories that already existed, we have to analyze how this happened. And the mechanism that was in play is what we call commoditization. Let's have a look at the analysis of this mechanism. There's a Harvard professor called Clayton Christensen who wrote a very famous book years ago called The Innovator's Dilemma, identifying why some innovators would fail at some point in other industries, looking at the automotive industries or the disk drive industry, etc. But actually this applies exactly to the software industry. And it applies to the software industry in a way that works like that. This is the basic framework, mental framework. Look at the vertical axis, it's performance from new categories, new software. At the bottom, the software does nothing. At the top, I mean, it has more and more functions and features. And of course, we have the time at the bottom. And the dotted line across represents the ability of the market and users to acquire new technologies and to become more and more sophisticated. As we know, we all become more and more sophisticated. But we have limitations, of course. I still can't use all the functions of my smartphone, of course. It'll take some time. So that's the way it evolves. Now let's look at this first entrance. The first wave of offering by proprietary vendors started at the level there with new products where the product functionalities were not quite exactly what the market was really wanted. Only the innovative or the early adopters would buy the product then. So the industry and the vendors would start and improve the product until there were new vendors coming in. That would create some sort of competition. But the competition at that point is not a competition by price, because these guys don't want to kill the market and don't want to kill each other. They know there is room for growth, so they would compete on functionalities. They would compete through the technology. They would compete by adding features, more features, announcing this, announcing that, announcing the new release, until at some point this race crosses the end user maturity line, until they go beyond what the market actually is able to absorb, and until a way that their products are huge and too complicated for the average end user. At this point, they have matured the technologies, maybe some standards have appeared, maybe some component vendors are appeared, and that lays the ground for the second generation. And the second generation of vendors, looking at what's made the first generation successful, would actually create or copy or imitate or emulate, if you like. But they would not control the market, because that market would be controlled by the early vendors. So the only way to actually get a foothold on the market is to change the model. And by changing the model, in other industries there are different ways to do it. In the software industry, it was the open source way. And open source actually literally killed some of the vendors that could not adapt, and some new second generation vendors with a new business model became and thrived and could grow by this new business model using the standards, etc. And that's a commoditization mechanism that explains what happened with the software the enterprise computing categories. But that's still looking at the past. And looking at the past means that if we understand that we've been successful, and at some point we can think and say, hey, now we've done that, it's just happened to us. How about now we analyze what we've done, and we look forward and try to control and replicate it in a way or another. Actually, you can't really replicate something. It cannot be commoditization, so it has to take a new form. So leveraging experience works like that. Timeline again horizontal, and the numbers vertical on the vertical axis. The number of products, software being offered on the market grows. The market awareness grows. Actually, you still have many users who don't care about open source. We know that. And actually they're right, because a user don't necessarily want an open source product. The user wants something that works, that supports its business. But still, the awareness grows, they understand the advantage of controlling, of being able to control, and strategically they mature. The experience grows. More and more people are trained on open source projects. More and more people have been implementing open source, are able to say it works, are able to demonstrate that it works. The press talks about it. There are more conferences. So open source becomes more and more established. And of course, we have some sort of evolution. So we were, in a way, with this disruption strategies, where the business opportunism was playing in favor of open source, and that was more or less, I would say, passive open source. It just happened with this disruption strategies. It was more or less opportunistic. But now, looking forward, understanding this, we can move to something more proactive. And actually, when you realize it's happening, when you look around, you understand that gradually open source has become the default way to develop new software. And of course, this is in a way logical, because open source initially was the implementation of academic behaviors of sharing and peer review applied to software development. So now we are reproducing this at the scale of the industry. Not only we are able to do that, but we also, in terms of the business open source, able to rely on a profitable model, because it makes sense economically. Now, talking about the economics of open source, you've all been asked this question. You can't really read it. This is the big question when we talk about open source in business terms. And every time you talk about it, somebody asks you, but how do they make, or how do you make money with free software? It's a question that is answered in 3 different ways. First of all, you realize that any kind of business enterprise project really implies only a tiny part of code of software. Most of the value is created in training, maintenance, implementation, integration, and making it run. Literally, a piece of code is like a cooking recipe. I mean, reading it, you can read it, but that doesn't make your lunch. I mean, really, the real value is created in the implementation, not just in the code itself, although it has value. But it doesn't happen without the implementation. Next, there are some real drivers, and it's all about competition, because we talk about the business, we talk about industry, and we talk about sustainable positioning for any kind of companies, and any kind of endeavor targeting an industrial, something to make money, or It's not just for the sake of developing software, not just for the sake of inventing new technologies, but to actually make something in industrial terms. It's driven either by commoditization, as we've already identified that, or by this way to create new software. And today the new software and the new way is all about collaborative innovation. And collaborative innovation and commoditization disruption is what explains many of open source projects. If you look at those on the, I've listed just quickly a few on the right. You look at the Apache web server, typically that was more a collaborative innovation at the point. But you look at Sugar CRM is definitely commoditization. It's replicating what Sybil, PeopleSoft, etc. have been doing, but in an open source way. What Spago BI is doing, same thing. Cognos, Business Object, all these guys have been imitated, mirrored, cloned, and they're gone. What we do with Jonas, which is the open source application server, that's against the WebSphere, against WebLogic products. Again, this is commoditization. Eclipse, even Eclipse was exactly like that. When IBM could not compete against Sun, they decided to kill the market by open sourcing everything and making it on a non-profit basis. And that made Sun out of this market. But if you look at today, what's happening with OpenStack? OpenStack is a Rackspace strategy aimed at repositioning Rackspace against Amazon and Google. These 600-pound gorillas hold the market. Now, how can a hoster like Rackspace survive, try to develop and breathe in this market? Would they do it by implementing the same and imitating Amazon strategy? They just couldn't. So they opened up the open source box of Pandora and say, okay, let's do it this way. Let's open source everything. And that's OpenStack. And now OpenStack really has some great momentum. And that's both a bit of commoditization, imitation, but collaborative innovation, because everything remains to be done in that field. Hadoop is pretty much the same. On the embedded, even in the embedded software, you have this top case and Polaris initiative at Eclipse, and that's a European thing involving the aerospace, automotive industry. All these guys are now collaborating, sharing something that was not possible to be shared before. It was unthinkable for them to share it, and now over the last 5 years, they've been understanding that they could not do it, they could not develop something sustainable over the long term without sharing everything at the beginning. And then we have another project with Commoditization, which is an open source cloud broker, new technologies, and the only way we can implement it is by opening it up and by developing in open source. And that's how many cloud technologies are happening. I will come back on cloud. Business models make money. And here, perhaps you have the generic business model for open source. Trying to make money on open source by just selling the code, this is total nonsense. The value is in the service. The value is in the implementation. Of course, you may have a part of product by selling add-ons or by selling the super products or the enterprise version, these open core strategies, which I really don't like, may be part of that. You can also serve like certified products, certification, so that the user is happy with this. Of course, we have all the service, and I've talked about the service a lot. But then you have this other third part, the one at the bottom left, which is in fact probably what's most original with open source, and which is what I call the insurance part of the business model. Users want to be supported, they want to have guarantees, they don't want open source to be exotic, they want open source to be supported, they want an insurance. And I think the insurance business model, when you look at the insurance companies, is, well, seems to be a pretty good business model. And that's the one that companies like selling software products are implementing. And I was about to say like like what? Like Red Hat. If you look at latest Red Hat report, you realize that the revenue was up 25%. 25% in 1 year. And the whole world is supposed to be in total crisis. They've become a $1 billion company. And if you look at, then these are the reports issued on the last fiscal year. You look at, what do? They sell like about $1 billion of service and subscriptions, make this 12% revenue, which is very nice margin by these terms. Okay, we're not talking Google terms or no Apple, fine. And if you look at the split here between subscriptions and training and services, you realize that you have 700 million here in subscriptions and only 100 in training and services, which means that the subscription model, the insurance model, is the one that makes Red Hat rich and successful. Subscription is like industrialized service. It's service that scales. It's not a service that has to be delivered by one person or another person. It's service that really scales. So let's look at new opportunities. We think that the open source sweet spot is infrastructure software. We don't talk about business process. We think the business process is the ownership of the vendor, the integrator, the one that cooks the meal, if you like. But then infrastructure is the sweet spot for open source. We think there is another evolution. We've been looking at commoditized software in the industry, but now we have cloud computing coming up, for instance, which is a great innovation. A whole new world is opening up for us. And in this world, you realize that if open source was following proprietary vendors in the traditional open enterprise computing space, it is really racing with them now. If you look at most of the all innovations that are driving the cloud computing are open source. We know that cloud computing is challenging open source because if open source or free software is defined by the way you access the code with cloud computing, you may not access the cloud. So we have to think about it and reposition this within our own values. So we decide that we realize that cloud and open cloud requires innovations. And we think that we want to foster open source for open clouds. And we think there is a right thing. The future will say whether we're right or not. But there are great evolutions, because you all know that little definition of cloud computing: infrastructure as a software, platform as a software, and services software. But now the new version is much more complex. Cloud computing is becoming something very complex, where there are so many opportunities that we have about 15 years of work ahead of us in this business open source strategy. But there are others we can touch in the industry. The whole aerospace, automotive industry, all the embedded world, the Internet of Things, all this is opening up open source. And this collaborative way of developing software. So now, that was my zoom, my focus on business open source. And I'm pretty sure that we can analyze and find all sorts of mechanisms and specificities and characteristics and attributes to the lifestyle open source or public policy open source, and maybe redefine that. I mean, this is just one way to define these different ways to look at open source. So if I go back to there's one thing I can see, is that we've had on one hand free software that defines freedom. It's a principle. It's something that is perfect, unique. I mean, there are how many perfect models are there? It could be one, pretty stable, and it's something that is absolutely fundamental. But I'm far from being perfect myself, and I cannot really too much identify with that, so I would identify more with the open source, which is the implementation in real life of free software. And I would say that Open source is not about freedom, but more about control. Control my decisions, control my investments, control my code, control the output of my work. It's something that is based on experience and practice. It's not intellectual. It's something that is based on how many hours there are in a day, who you know, and people making decisions. It's far from being perfect. The real world is not perfect at all. And it happens through many different forms. In Marxist terms, we call them forms. I would like to call them avatars to match the technology environment where we are. And it's imminently changing. It's changing because it's impacted by experience, it's impacted by what happens. And it's what I would call essential. And for those who know about dialectics, you will recognize that on one hand, the result of what we look at is the combination of something that is fundamental and expressed into ways that are being essential. And that's the dialectic of open source. Now, just to finish, and for fun, I will just aim at identifying those 3 avatars on a geographic basis, looking at how I would rate them between Brazil, North America, Europe, and China, and we have experience in all these regions. So I would say that public policy open source, which is the green one, is probably leading here in Brazil. I don't see the equivalent in any other country. Whereas business strategy open source is certainly big in North America, and these countries are examples. Europe is probably lagging there. I would say it's pretty much in the average, and I would look at China being very behind. Funnily, interestingly enough, lifestyle open source is something I see very big in China. I've been in conferences on Saturday afternoon and Sundays where all these guys under 30 years are there. So that's what they do. Do they spend their weekends at open source conferences and talking open source? And it's a way to express their freedom, to express control on their life. And I think it's very significant that this is quite big in China. So this is maybe the picture, but even more fun would be to identify the trends. And then I would say that some sites in Brazil tell me that maybe the public policy open source is not so, there are maybe some changes. Maybe we've known the best, I don't know. Certainly the business strategy open source is strong and will remain strong in the States because they have lots of investment and it's still pushing there. Again, Europe, pretty much average. And if I want to concentrate on France, which is where I come from, I would say that the situation is worse than that. And so if I look at China, lifestyle open source, very strong, very, very strong. There's a great demand there, and the rest is not happening. Virtually not happening, really. I would not believe that. So this is more for the fun, for the discussion. And with this, I thank you very much for your patience. So we have 5 minutes for questions, either here or outside, as you wish.
Hi. You make a very clear distinction between free software and open source. What do you see as the tendency for the future for free software, especially? What's your opinion on it?
Well, first of all, I want to apologize because it's a little bit simplistic to do that, but free software was a good basis to start with and to develop how many differences and different ways we have to see it. Actually, I still think that free software, for me, it just remains like a reference. So whether we will have free software actually implemented and people living the life of free software the way it is defined in its more idealistic way, I don't know. Personally, I can't. I'm not an engineer myself, so I can't really identify. So I'm certainly not the right person to ask. But I'm pretty sure that the more people will be vigilant about free software, the better off everybody else will be, and maybe the better off open source will be. because we would not have open source today if it were not for the initial vision of free software.
Thank you.
With the spread of cloud-based platforms as a service and software as a service, how do you think that changes the way free software and open source software lives in the community?
Well, we don't exactly what the future holds because we don't exactly how it was going to evolve. First of all, we need to identify whether there is a problem or whether there is a risk. And again, as I said, we were very comfortable by defining free software or even open source by these 4 freedoms and the way and access to software. And with cloud computing, the software is behind the service. So we have access to service, and we have yet to define how we control the software that is behind the service that is delivered to you, and B, what is and how you define what we can call free service or open service. And I think with cloud computing, the task is more complicated now because we have to be aware and alert and be careful with both the code that will be implemented and the way it is controlled, and all this the new licenses, the FRO licenses will help us do that, and the way these services are actually delivered, and how these services will not deprive you from either freedom or control, if I use the different perspectives, because it's very easy to use free software to deliver a service that would lock you in for some reason, and that is the danger. Okay, well, thank you very much.